shadows of the medieval world, the cruelest figures in history. Welcome, dear listeners, to another journey into the darkest chapters of human history. This is Historical Whispers, your sanctuary for the untold stories that shaped our world. If this tale of medieval shadows captivates your imagination, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like to support our work, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these forgotten voices from the past to your ears. Tonight, we venture into an era where the line between civilization and savagery blurred like morning mist over blood-soaked battlefields. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, witnessed humanity at both its most noble and most depraved. Behind the romantic tales of gallant knights and fair maidens lay a brutal reality where power was seized with iron fists and held through unimaginable terror. Picture, if you will, a world where the scream of tortured souls echoed from castle dungeons, where public executions drew crowds like modern sporting events, and where the powerful viewed human life as mere currency in their games of dominion. This was an age when a single ruler's whim could condemn thousands to agonizing deaths, when religious fervor justified the most heinous atrocities, and when the common folk lived in constant fear of their overlord's capricious cruelty. As we pull back the velvet curtain of history, we encounter figures whose names have become synonymous with human evil. These were not mere products of their times, but individuals who exceeded even the brutal standards of their era, leaving scars upon the collective memory of humanity that persist to this day. The cold winds of the Carpathian Mountains carry whispers of our first tale, one that begins in the mist-shrouded lands of Wallachia, where a prince would earn immortality not through noble deeds, but through acts so monstrous they would inspire legends of the undead. Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, entered this world in 1431 within the fortress walls of Siasora. His father, Vlad II, bore the surname Dracul, meaning dragon, earned through membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric brotherhood sworn to defend Christendom against the advancing Ottoman tide. Young Vlad would inherit this legacy, but twist it into something far more sinister. The boy's formative years were marked by a betrayal that would forge his twisted soul. When Vlad was merely 11 years old, his father made a devil's bargain with Sultan Murad II. In exchange for Wallachia's continued semi-independence, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were surrendered as hostages to the Ottoman court. Imagine the terror of these children, torn from their mountain homeland and thrust into a foreign palace where their lives hung by the thinnest of threads. For 6 long years, Vlad endured this gilded captivity, watching as the Ottomans employed psychological warfare alongside their military might. He witnessed the practice of impalement, a punishment the Turks reserved for their most despised enemies. The victim would be forced onto a sharpened wooden stake, gravity slowly drawing their body downward as the point emerged from their mouth or shoulder. Death could take hours, sometimes days, while the condemned writhed in unimaginable agony. These childhood horrors planted seeds of hatred that would bloom into monstrous cruelty. When news reached the Ottoman court that Vlad's father had been assassinated and buried alive by rival nobles, the young prince's transformation began. The boy who had once played in Transylvanian meadows was becoming something altogether more dangerous. Released from captivity in 1448, Vlad returned to find Wallachia torn apart by competing factions. Hungarian influence battled Ottoman interests while local boyars, the noble class, pursued their own ambitions. The teenage prince, now hardened by years of humiliation and loss, seized power briefly before being forced into exile once more. But this temporary defeat only sharpened his resolve and refined his understanding of terror as a political tool. When Vlad reclaimed his throne permanently in 1456, he was no longer the frightened boy who had been dragged away in chains. He had become something far more terrifying, a ruler who understood that in a world of competing empires and treacherous nobles, only the most ruthless could survive. His first act upon securing power would establish a pattern of brutality that would define his reign and horrify Europe for centuries to come. The Easter feast of 1457 began as a celebration of Christ's resurrection, but ended as a tableau from hell itself. Vlad had invited hundreds of boyar families to his court, promising a grand banquet to mark the holy day. These nobles, who had murdered his father and plagued Wallachia with their internecine warfare, arrived in their finest clothes, expecting wine and revelry. Instead, they found their doom waiting with a smile. As the feast reached its height, with goblets raised and laughter echoing through the great hall, Vlad's guards quietly surrounded the gathering. At their prince's signal, they burst through the doors like wolves upon sheep. The nobles, heavy with food and wine, could offer little resistance as they were seized and dragged from the hall. What followed was not mere execution, but a deliberate display of sadistic artistry. One by one, each boyar was impaled upon sharpened stakes that had been prepared in advance. Vlad had studied the Ottoman technique during his captivity and perfected it into his own signature of terror. The stakes were positioned to avoid immediate death, allowing the victims to linger in agony for hours while their families watched. Some accounts describe how Vlad dined among these writhing forms, calmly cutting his meat while the screams of the dying provided his dinner music. This was not random violence, but calculated political theater. Every impaled noble sent a message to potential rivals that defiance would meet with unimaginable suffering. Vlad understood that in a world where armies could be bought and loyalty was temporary, fear was the only currency that never lost its value. Word of the Easter massacre spread like wildfire across Eastern Europe, but it was only the beginning of Vlad's reign of terror. Soon, the roads leading to Targovist, his capital, became known as the Forest of the Impaled. Thousands of stakes lined these pathways, each bearing a rotting corpse in various stages of decay. Merchants, diplomats, and common travelers alike had to navigate this grotesque gallery of death, the stench of decomposition filling their nostrils while ravens and crows feasted overhead. Vlad's cruelty knew no boundaries of age, gender, or station. Pregnant women were impaled through their wombs, their unborn children dying alongside them. Children were forced to watch their parents' executions before meeting similar fates. Old men and women were shown no mercy despite their frailty. The prince seemed to take particular pleasure in forcing families to witness each other's torment, understanding that psychological anguish could be even more devastating than physical pain. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople and terror of Christendom, was himself horrified by reports of Vlad's methods. When Ottoman envoys arrived at the Wallachian court wearing turbans, as was their custom, Vlad demanded they remove their headwear in his presence. When they explained that religious law forbade this, Vlad ordered his guards to nail the turbans directly to their skulls, ensuring they would never be removed again. Foreign merchants found themselves trapped in Vlad's web of cruelty for even minor infractions. One story tells of a merchant who complained about theft in Wallachia markets. Vlad appeared sympathetic and promised to recover the stolen goods. The next morning, the merchant found his missing items returned, along with an extra gold piece. When he honestly reported the surplus, Vlad revealed that this had been a test. Had the merchant kept the extra coin, he would have been impaled for theft. Instead, his honesty saved his life, though he fled Wallachia immediately, understanding how close he had come to becoming another decoration for the prince's forest of stakes. Vlad's reputation for sadistic creativity grew with each passing season. He would force Turkish prisoners to participate in their own executions, making them sharpen the stakes that would kill them. Captured soldiers were skinned alive, their flesh fashioned into grotesque banners that flew from castle walls. Some victims were boiled in enormous cauldrons, while others were roasted over slow fires, their screams echoing across the Wallachian countryside. The psychological warfare extended beyond mere killing. Vlad understood that the anticipation of death could be as effective as death itself. Prisoners were kept in dungeons beneath his castle, listening to the screams of those being tortured above while awaiting their own turn. Some were driven mad by the waiting, begging for death rather than enduring another day of dread. When Sultan Mehmed finally launched his invasion in 1462, he brought a massive army across the Danube, confident that he could crush this troublesome vassal. But Vlad had prepared a welcome that would test even the Ottoman conqueror's iron nerves. As the Turkish forces advanced deeper into Wallachia, they found a landscape transformed into a nightmare realm. Every village had been burned, every well poisoned, every field salted to prevent crops from growing. The Ottoman army found no food, no water, and no shelter as they marched through this desolate wasteland. But the true horror awaited them outside Targovist itself, where Vlad had prepared his masterpiece of terror. 20,000 Turkish prisoners, captured in earlier skirmishes, had been impaled in neat rows stretching for miles around the capital. The forest of stakes stood like a grotesque army of the dead, each corpse positioned to face the approaching Ottoman forces. The stench was so overwhelming that hardened Turkish soldiers, veterans of countless battles, vomited at the sight. Even maimed, who had ordered massacres from Constantinople to Belgrade, reportedly turned his horse around and retreated rather than march his army through this valley of death. The psychological impact was precisely what Vlad had intended. His small principality could never match the Ottoman Empire in conventional warfare, but through sheer brutality, he had made himself too costly to conquer. The Sultan's retreat marked the high point of Vlad's power, but it also sealed his ultimate fate. Such extreme methods inevitably create enemies, and even allies grow uncomfortable with too much success built on terror. Vlad's downfall came not from Ottoman armies, but from his own supposed allies. The Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, grew alarmed by his vassals' methods and the international attention they attracted. In 1462, shortly after his triumph over the Ottomans, Vlad was arrested during a diplomatic meeting and imprisoned in a Hungarian fortress. For more than a decade, he languished in captivity while his enemies divided Wallachia among themselves. When Vlad finally regained his freedom in 1476, he found a changed world. New alliances had formed, old enemies had grown stronger, and his reputation, while still fearsome, could no longer compensate for his weakened position. His final campaign was brief and desperate. Near Bucharest, in the closing days of 1476, Vlad the Impaler met his end in a skirmish whose details remain shrouded in mystery. Some say he was killed by Ottoman forces. Others claim his own men murdered him to curry favor with his enemies. What remains undisputed is that Vlad's head was severed and sent to Sultan maimed as proof of his death. The man who had terrorized Europe was reduced to a trophy, his features no doubt twisted in a final expression of rage or surprise. His body was allegedly buried at Snagov Monastery, though when archaeologists opened the presumed grave in 1931, they found it empty, adding one last mystery to his dark legacy. The name Dracula, derived from his father's title, would outlive the man by centuries. When Bram Stoker crafted his vampire novel in 1897, he drew inspiration from the Wallachian prince's reputation for bloodthirst. The fictional Count Dracula, with his castle in Transylvania and his appetite for human blood, became a pale reflection of the real monster who had once ruled through terror alone. Yet even as we recoil from Vlad's monstrous cruelty, we must acknowledge the historical context that shaped him. The Ottoman Empire was expanding rapidly, consuming Christian kingdoms like a vast machine of conquest. Traditional methods of diplomacy and warfare had failed repeatedly against this seemingly unstoppable force. In this desperate situation, Vlad chose terror as his weapon, understanding that psychological warfare could accomplish what conventional armies could not. This does not excuse his actions or diminish their horror, but it helps explain how a frightened boy became a monster. The Middle Ages were an era when survival often demanded the abandonment of mercy, when rulers faced the stark choice between becoming predators or becoming prey. Vlad chose to be the most terrifying predator of all, and in doing so, he achieved a twisted form of immortality. His story serves as a dark mirror, reflecting humanity's capacity for both suffering and inflicting suffering. In the forests of impaled corpses, in the screams echoing from castle dungeons, in the terror that gripped an entire region, we see what happens when power is unrestrained by conscience or compassion. Vlad the Impaler stands as perhaps history's most vivid reminder that the monsters we fear in our nightmares pale in comparison to the monsters that human beings can become. But Vlad was not alone in his capacity for cruelty. Across the medieval world, other figures were writing their own chapters in humanity's darkest book. To the west, where the cross of Christ flew over armies of conquest, a different kind of horror was unfolding in the name of God himself. The year 1095 marked a turning point in medieval history. Though few who witnessed Pope Urban II's speech at Clermont could have imagined the centuries of bloodshed they were unleashing. Standing before a crowd of nobles, knights, and clergy in a field outside the French town, Urban delivered words that would echo across the ages like a war cry from hell itself. The Pope's message was deceptively simple. The Holy Land, where Christ had walked and died, lay under the control of Muslim infidels. Jerusalem, the city of David and Solomon, was closed to Christian pilgrims. The Byzantine emperor had requested aid against the advancing Seljuk Turks. It was time, Urban declared, for the warriors of Christendom to take up the cross and march east to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The crowd's response was electric. Voices rose in unison, shouting Deus vult, God wills it, as men began tearing strips from their clothing to fashion crosses. In that moment, Urban had unleashed forces that would transform the medieval world, bringing death and destruction to millions, while forever staining the banner of Christianity with innocent blood. What followed was not the orderly military expedition Urban had envisioned, but a series of chaotic, brutal campaigns that would span nearly 2 centuries. The First Crusade alone involved tens of thousands of participants, from noble knights seeking glory to landless peasants seeking escape from their miserable lives. United by religious fervor and the promise of spiritual reward, they began a journey that would test the very limits of human brutality. The crusading armies had not even left Europe before the violence began. As they marched through the Rhine Valley, these self-proclaimed soldiers of Christ turned their fury against the Jewish communities they encountered. In city after city, Jewish families faced a horrific choice: immediate conversion to Christianity or death. Many chose martyrdom over apostasy, with entire families committing suicide rather than abandoning their faith. In Mainz, one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe, the horror reached its peak during the spring of 1196. Rabbi Kalanimus ben Meshulam gathered his congregation in the synagogue as the crusading mob surrounded the building. Rather than face forced conversion, he led his people in a final act of defiance. Fathers slit the throats of their children, husbands killed their wives, and then themselves, believing that martyrdom was preferable to the abandonment of their ancestral faith. The Crusaders broke down the synagogue doors to find over 1,000 corpses, men, women, and children lying in pools of blood, their faces turned skyward in final prayer. Some Crusaders wept at the sight, but others saw it as divine judgment upon the killers of Christ. They pillaged the bodies, stealing jewelry and gold teeth before setting the building ablaze. The smoke rose black against the German sky, carrying with it the ashes of an ancient community that had flourished for centuries. Similar scenes played out across the Rhineland as crusading fever transformed ordinary Christians into bloodthirsty mobs. In Worms, Speyer, and Cologne, Jewish quarters were burned and their inhabitants slaughtered. Children were baptized by force before being murdered, their crusader killers believing this act would save their souls even as it ended their lives. The very people who claimed to march in the name of the Prince of Peace were writing the opening chapters of European anti-Semitism in blood. When the various crusading armies finally converged in Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios was horrified by what he saw. Instead of the disciplined military force he had requested, he faced a swarm of armed pilgrims whose religious zeal was matched only by their capacity for violence. Many were already stained with innocent blood, and their leaders spoke openly of the glory they would win in slaughtering infidels. The march across Anatolia transformed these crusaders from pilgrims into predators. The desert sun, lack of supplies, and constant harassment by Turkish forces took a terrible toll. Horses died by the thousands, forcing knights to fight on foot. Water became more precious than gold, and men killed each other for a single cup of brackish liquid. Disease ran rampant through the camps, and the stench of unburied corpses followed the army like a pestilential cloud. At Antioch, the Crusaders endured an 8-month siege that reduced them to cannibalism. They ate their own horses first, then the bodies of fallen enemies, and finally, according to some accounts, their own dead. A chronicler named Albert of Aix wrote with horror about Christian soldiers roasting the flesh of Saracen children on spits, claiming it was the most delicious meat they had ever tasted. The army that had begun as a holy pilgrimage was becoming something monstrous, transformed by suffering into a force of nearly inhuman savagery. But it was at Jerusalem itself that the Crusaders revealed the true depths of their capacity for evil. After a siege lasting 5 weeks, they breached the walls on July 15, 1099, and poured into the holy city like a tide of vengeance. What followed was not military conquest, but systematic massacre, on a scale that shocked even the blood-soaked medieval world. The slaughter began at dawn and continued without pause for 3 days and nights. Muslim civilians who had sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque were burned alive when the Crusaders set the building ablaze. Jewish families who had barricaded themselves in their synagogue met the same fate, their screams mixing with the crackling of flames as the roof collapsed. In the streets, Crusader knights rode down fleeing civilians, their swords rising and falling in mechanical rhythm as they cut down anyone in their path. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilars, who witnessed the massacre, wrote with evident satisfaction about wading through blood that reached his ankles. He described how crusaders would grab screaming infants by their feet and dash their heads against stone walls, laughing as the tiny skulls shattered. Pregnant women were cut open, their unborn children torn from their wombs and trampled underfoot. Elderly men and women were herded into groups and slaughtered en masse, their bodies left to rot in the summer heat. Near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was said to have been buried and resurrected, the Crusaders paused in their killing to kneel in prayer. With blood-soaked hands and gore-stained clothes, they gave thanks to God for their victory, while all around them lay the corpses of innocents. Some wept with religious ecstasy, believing they had truly served their Savior. Others laughed with battle madness, drunk on violence and the intoxicating power of life and death. Contemporary estimates suggest that between 70,000 and 100,000 people died during those 3 days of horror. The entire Muslim and Jewish populations of Jerusalem were either killed or enslaved, and many Eastern Christians died as well, butchered by crusaders who could not distinguish between different groups of non-Westerners. The city that 3 great religions held sacred became a charnel house, its streets flowing with blood and carpeted with the dead. When the killing finally ended, the Crusaders faced the practical problem of disposing of thousands of corpses before disease could spread. They forced captured Muslims to drag the bodies outside the city walls, where enormous pyres burned for weeks. The smell of burning flesh hung over Jerusalem like a foul cloud, and travelers reported catching the stench from miles away. Even in death, the victims of Crusader zealotry found no peace. The establishment of the Crusader states in the aftermath of this conquest created a permanent presence of Western Christianity in the Middle East. But it was a presence built on foundations of blood and maintained through continued violence. For nearly 2 centuries, these Latin kingdoms survived by playing various Muslim factions against each other, while periodically receiving reinforcements from Europe in the form of new crusading expeditions. Each subsequent crusade brought fresh atrocities. The Second Crusade, launched in response to the fall of Edessa in 1144, saw more pogroms against European Jews and achieved virtually nothing in the Holy Land. The Third Crusade, featuring legendary figures like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, was marked by acts of shocking brutality on both sides. At Acre, Richard ordered the massacre of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, including women and children, when Saladin failed to meet his ransom demands. But perhaps the most damning indictment of the crusading movement came with the Fourth Crusade, which never reached the Holy Land at all. Instead, this expedition was diverted to attack Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the East. In 1204, the Crusaders stormed the Byzantine capital and subjected it to 3 days of pillaging that matched anything they had done to Muslim cities. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Eastern Christendom, was desecrated as Crusaders stabled their horses in the nave and stripped gold from the altars. Sacred relics were stolen or destroyed. Ancient manuscripts were burned for fuel, and priceless works of art were melted down for their precious metals. Nuns were raped in their convents, priests were murdered at their altars, and the accumulated treasures of 1,000 years of Christian civilization were scattered to the winds. A contemporary Byzantine chronicler, Nyctas Choniates, wrote with anguish about seeing Western crusaders, drunk on wine and blood, dancing on the altar of the Hagia Sophia, while prostitutes sang obscene songs from the patriarch's throne. These men, who claimed to serve Christ, had transformed the holiest site in Eastern Christianity into a scene from a pagan bacchanal. The sack of Constantinople effectively ended any hope of reuniting Eastern and Western Christianity, and severely weakened the Byzantine Empire, leaving it vulnerable to eventual Ottoman conquest. The Crusaders had achieved the opposite of their stated goals, weakening Christendom rather than strengthening it and proving that religious fervor, when unconstrained by moral limits, could justify any atrocity. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the Crusades had unleashed forces that would terrorize the continent for generations. The Albigensian Crusade, launched by Pope Innocent III in 1209, brought the full fury of crusading warfare to bear against the Cathar heretics of southern France. The Cathars, who practiced a form of Christianity that rejected material wealth and the authority of the Catholic Church, found themselves branded as dangerous enemies of orthodoxy. The papal legate Arnaud Amalric, who led the spiritual side of this crusade, embodied the fanatical cruelty that had come to characterize the movement. When the crusading army besieged the town of Béziers, which sheltered both Catholics and Cathars, soldiers asked how they could distinguish between the two groups. Amalric's reply became one of history's most chilling examples of religious extremism. "Kill them all, God will know his own." The massacre that followed consumed the entire population of Béziers, estimated at 20,000 souls. Men, women, and children were slaughtered indiscriminately as the Crusaders swept through the town like a plague of locusts. The cathedral, where hundreds had sought sanctuary, became a slaughterhouse as soldiers cut down terrified civilians who clutched crucifixes and begged for mercy in the name of Christ. This pattern repeated itself throughout Languedoc as the Albigensian Crusade consumed the vibrant culture of southern France. At Marmande, the Crusaders killed every inhabitant they could find, estimated at 5,000 people. At Lavaur, the Cathar perfect Guraud was thrown into a well and stoned to death, while her followers were burned alive in groups of 50. The troubadour culture that had flourished in the region, with its emphasis on courtly love and religious tolerance, was systematically destroyed. The siege of Montségur in 1244 marked the effective end of the Cathar heresy. After a 10-month siege, the last major Cathar stronghold surrendered on terms that offered safe passage to those who would renounce their faith. 220 Cathars chose martyrdom instead, walking singing into a massive pyre that burned for hours. Their courage in the face of death was matched only by the cruelty of their persecutors, who watched the flames with satisfaction, believing they were serving God's will. The Albigensian Crusade succeeded in its goal of eliminating Cathar heresy, but the cost was enormous. An entire civilization was destroyed, thousands of innocents died, and the precedent was set for using religious warfare against internal enemies. The Inquisition that followed would institutionalize this persecution, creating a permanent machinery of religious terror that would plague Europe for centuries. As we reflect on the legacy of the Crusades, we see how noble ideals can be corrupted into instruments of unimaginable evil. The desire to serve God, to protect fellow Christians, and to secure access to holy sites was genuine among many crusaders. But when combined with medieval Europe's existing prejudices, economic motivations, and political ambitions, these ideals became justifications for some of history's most horrific atrocities. The Crusades left scars that have never fully healed. The mistrust between Christianity and Islam that they fostered continues to influence world events today. The techniques of religious persecution they pioneered would be refined and employed against countless other groups throughout European history. Most damaging of all, they established the principle that any act, no matter how cruel, could be justified if committed in service of a holy cause. In the forests of impaled corpses left by Vlad the Impaler, and the blood-soaked streets of Jerusalem conquered by the Crusaders, we see the same fundamental truth about human nature. When moral constraints are abandoned, when enemies are dehumanized, and when violence is sanctified by higher purpose, ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil. The medieval world, for all its achievements in art, architecture, and learning, was also an age when such transformations were all too common. Yet even in this darkness, we must remember that there were always those who resisted the tide of cruelty. Monks who hid Jewish families from crusading mobs, knights who refused to participate in massacres, common people who showed mercy even when their leaders demanded blood. These voices of conscience remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the capacity for compassion never entirely dies. As we continue our journey through the shadows of medieval history, we encounter figures whose cruelty was not driven by religious fervor or political necessity, but by something far more personal and disturbing. In the halls of power, where absolute authority corrupted absolutely, some rulers discovered that the suffering of others could become a source of pleasure in itself. The reign of King John of England, from 1199 to 1216, stands as a testament to how personal inadequacy and spite can manifest as systematic cruelty when coupled with royal authority. Born the youngest son of Henry II, John was never intended to rule, and his personality seemed to confirm the wisdom of primogeniture in keeping lesser men from the throne. John's path to power was paved with betrayal and violence from the beginning. While his brother Richard the Lionheart fought in the Holy Land during the Third Crusade, John conspired against him with Philip Augustus of France, attempting to seize the throne through treachery. When Richard died in 1199, killed by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle, John's claim faced challenge from his nephew Arthur of Brittany, whose superior hereditary right was supported by many nobles. The fate of young Arthur would become one of the darkest stains on John's reputation and a perfect example of his character. In 1202, John captured the 16-year-old prince during a siege and imprisoned him in the Tower of Rouen. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, but contemporary chroniclers agree that Arthur disappeared forever from that fortress, almost certainly murdered on his uncle's orders. The most detailed account comes from the chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, who claimed that John, in a drunken rage, personally killed Arthur with his own hands before dumping the body in the Seine River. Whether this story is accurate or not, the young prince's disappearance marked John as a kinslayer in the eyes of his contemporaries, a crime so heinous that it violated the most fundamental bonds of family and feudal loyalty. John's cruelty was not limited to political rivals, but extended to anyone who crossed his volatile temper or failed to meet his insatiable financial demands. The Chronicle of Matthew Paris records numerous instances of the king's sadistic behavior, including the case of a Jewish moneylender named Abraham of Bristol, who refused to pay an enormous fine. John ordered that one of Abraham's teeth be pulled each day until he agreed to pay. After 7 days of agony, Abraham finally submitted, but the king's reputation for creative torture was established. The treatment of William de Breas, once one of John's most trusted allies, demonstrates how quickly the king's favor could turn to murderous hatred. When de Breas fell into debt, and his wife Maud made the mistake of publicly stating that she would not hand over her sons as hostages because she knew what John had done to Arthur, the king's revenge was swift and merciless. John pursued the de Breas family with relentless vindictiveness, driving them into exile and seizing their lands. When Maud and her eldest son William were finally captured in Ireland, John had them imprisoned in Corfe Castle. There, mother and son were sealed in a dungeon and left to starve to death. When their bodies were discovered 11 days later, Maud was found to have gnawed the flesh from her son's face in her final desperate attempt to survive. The image of a mother driven by starvation to cannibalize her own child became a symbol of John's inhumanity. The king's sexual appetites were as uncontrolled as his temper, and he used his royal authority to satisfy his lusts without regard for consent or consequences. Contemporary chronicles speak of noblewomen who fled to convents rather than face the king's advances, and of husbands who paid enormous bribes to keep their wives safe from royal attention. John's court became a place where no woman of beauty was safe, regardless of her station or marital status. One particularly infamous case involved the daughter of Robert Fitzwalter, one of England's most powerful barons. When Fitzwalter refused to hand over his daughter to satisfy the king's desires, John had her poisoned, according to later accounts. Whether this story is accurate or not, it reflects the contemporary belief that John would stop at nothing to satisfy his appetites, even murder. John's financial exactions were legendary in their creativity and cruelty. He invented new taxes and fines with shameless innovation, finding ways to extract money from every possible source. Widows were forced to pay enormous sums for the right to remain unmarried or to choose their own husbands. Jews faced special levies that could bankrupt entire communities. Even the church was not safe from his rapacious demands, leading to a 6-year interdict that closed every church in England. The king's treatment of prisoners was particularly cruel, even by medieval standards. The dungeons of his castles became notorious for their horrific conditions, where men rotted for years without trial or hope of release. Some prisoners were deliberately starved to death, others were blinded or castrated, and a few simply disappeared entirely, their fate known only to the king and his executioners. Perhaps most revealing of John's character was his treatment of the Welsh Prince Griffith ap Rhys, whom he captured during one of his many campaigns against the Welsh. Instead of holding Griffith for ransom or executing him quickly, John kept him imprisoned for years, periodically bringing him out to be tortured for the entertainment of the court. The prince was blinded, castrated, and finally hanged, but only after enduring years of systematic abuse designed to break his spirit completely. The rebellion that eventually forced John to sign Magna Carta in 1215 was not driven primarily by constitutional theory, but by the accumulated grievances of nobles who had witnessed or experienced the king's cruelty firsthand. The document that emerged from the confrontation at Runnymede was as much an attempt to restrain a tyrant as it was a charter of rights. Even after signing the Great Charter, John had no intention of honoring its provisions. He immediately appealed to Pope Innocent III to annul the agreement, and began gathering mercenary forces to crush the rebellion. The civil war that followed was marked by John's characteristic vindictiveness, as he unleashed foreign soldiers upon his own kingdom, encouraging them to pillage and burn without restraint. The king's death in 1216, allegedly from dysentery contracted during the campaign, was greeted with relief by most of his subjects. Even his own supporters had grown weary of his excesses, and many suspected that he had been poisoned by someone close to him who could no longer tolerate his rule. John was buried with little ceremony, and few mourned his passing. The legacy of John's reign extended far beyond England's borders, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked royal power. His cruelty was not the product of political necessity or religious fervor, but seemed to spring from some fundamental defect in his character, a capacity for inflicting suffering that went beyond any rational purpose. Yet John's story also illustrates how individual cruelty could catalyze positive change. The barons who forced him to sign Magna Carta were not motivated by abstract principles of justice, but by their personal experiences of his tyranny. The document they created would eventually evolve into fundamental principles of constitutional government and individual rights, proving that even the worst tyrants could inadvertently contribute to human progress. As John's reign of terror finally ended, the medieval world continued to produce figures whose capacity for cruelty seemed to know no bounds. In the East, new horrors were emerging as ambitious warlords carved out empires built on mountains of skulls and rivers of blood. The name Timur, known to history as Tamerlane or Timur the Lame, strikes terror into hearts even today. centuries after his death. Born in 1336 in the windswept steppes near Samarkand, this Turco-Mongol warlord would prove that the age of the great nomadic conquerors was far from over. Where Genghis Khan had built an empire through ruthless efficiency, Timur would construct his through such overwhelming brutality that entire civilizations would crumble at the mere mention of his approach. Timur's early life was marked by the constant warfare that plagued Central Asia in the 14th century. As a young man, he suffered wounds that left him with a withered leg and arm, earning him the nickname, the Lame. These physical disabilities might have ended the ambitions of a lesser man, but for Timur, they became sources of rage that would fuel decades of conquest and massacre. The future conqueror learned the arts of war in the harsh school of steppe politics, where survival depended on one's ability to inspire both loyalty and terror. He understood that in a world of shifting tribal alliances, only the most feared leader could maintain power. Unlike other medieval rulers who viewed cruelty as a necessary evil, Timur elevated it to an art form, using terror as his primary weapon of conquest. Timur's first major campaign began in the 1360s, as he systematically conquered the fragmented remnants of the Mongol Empire in Central Asia. His methods were calculated to maximize psychological impact rather than mere military victory. When the city of Sistan resisted his advance, Timur ordered the construction of a tower from the skulls of its defenders, each head carefully positioned to face outward so that approaching enemies could see the fate awaiting them. The siege of Isfahan in 1387 demonstrated Timur's evolution from mere warlord to architect of systematic horror. Initially, the Persian city surrendered without resistance, and Timur promised clemency to its inhabitants. However, when a riot broke out among his troops, killing several of his soldiers, the conqueror's response was swift and merciless. Timur ordered the massacre of every living soul within Isfahan's walls. His soldiers were given quotas. Each man was required to present 70 severed heads as proof of his participation in the slaughter. By the time the killing ended, over 70,000 people had died, and their heads were built into pyramids that dotted the city like monuments to human evil. Contemporary accounts describe how the towers of skulls were so numerous that they could be seen from miles away, their hollow eye sockets staring blindly across the devastated landscape. But Isfahan was merely practice for the horrors that Timur would unleash on a grander scale. His invasion of India in 1398 would prove that even the Sultan of Delhi, one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world, was no match for this master of terror. Before the main assault began, Timur ordered the execution of 100,000 prisoners who had been captured during the approach to Delhi. These men were killed not in the heat of battle, but as a cold, calculated act designed to strike fear into the defenders. The slaughter was carried out systematically, with different units of Timur's army responsible for different groups of prisoners. Some were beheaded, others were trampled by elephants, and still others were burned alive in massive pyres that lit the night sky like hellish beacons. The screams of the dying could be heard for miles. and the smoke from burning flesh hung over the camp like a dark cloud that blotted out the stars. When Sultan Nasiruddin Mahmud Shah Tughlaq finally emerged to give battle, his army was already demoralized by the reports of massacre that had preceded Timur's arrival. The Battle of Panipat was less a military engagement than a rout, as Indian forces fled in terror rather than face an enemy whose reputation for brutality had already broken their will to fight. The sack of Delhi that followed was an orgy of destruction that shocked even the hardened chroniclers of the medieval world. For 3 days and nights, Timur's soldiers were given free rein to kill, rape, and pillage without restraint. Entire neighborhoods were put to the torch, their inhabitants burned alive in their homes. Mosques and schools were desecrated, their libraries burned, and their scholars murdered. The city's famous markets, which had drawn merchants from across Asia, were reduced to ash and rubble. The human cost of Delhi's destruction was staggering. Contemporary estimates suggest that over 100,000 people died during those 3 days of horror, while countless others were enslaved and marched back to Samarkand to serve their conqueror. The city itself was so thoroughly destroyed that it would take decades to recover, and some neighborhoods remained empty ruins for generations. Timur's cruelty extended beyond mere killing to psychological torture, designed to break the spirits of his enemies completely. During the siege of Baghdad in 1401, he ordered that every soldier in his army bring him 2 severed heads from the city's defenders. When the quota was met, these 20,000 heads were built into 120 towers arranged in neat rows around the devastated city. The mathematical precision of this horror, the careful organization of mass murder, revealed a mind that had moved beyond simple brutality into something approaching systematic evil. The conqueror took particular pleasure in devising new methods of execution for different types of enemies. Scholars and religious leaders were often buried alive, their learning and piety providing no protection against Timur's hatred of intellectual resistance. Merchants were sometimes boiled alive in enormous cauldrons, their wealth made useless by their agonizing deaths. Warriors were impaled on stakes or skinned alive, their courage turned into a spectacle for Timur's entertainment. At Damascus in 1401, Timur demonstrated his capacity for combining cultural destruction with mass murder. After capturing the great Syrian city, he ordered the systematic execution of its craftsmen and artisans, but not before forcing them to complete works of art for his capital at Samarkand. These skilled workers, who represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition, were murdered as soon as their usefulness ended, their blood spattering the very works of beauty they had been forced to create. The psychological impact of Timur's methods extended far beyond his immediate victims. Cities across Asia surrendered at the first news of his approach, their inhabitants preferring submission to the certain horror of resistance. Entire regions were depopulated as people fled before his advancing armies, creating vast empty zones where only corpses and carrion birds remained. Timur understood that reputation could be more valuable than any army. he deliberately cultivated an image of supernatural evil, encouraging stories about his demonic origins and inhuman appetites. His court chroniclers were instructed to record his atrocities in loving detail, ensuring that accounts of his cruelty would spread ahead of his armies like an advance guard of terror. The conqueror's attention to the details of suffering revealed a mind that found genuine pleasure in the pain of others. He would personally oversee mass executions, offering suggestions to his executioners on how to prolong agony or increase terror. Prisoners were sometimes kept alive for days while being slowly flayed, their screams providing entertainment for Timur's feasts. When Timur died in 1405, while preparing for an invasion of China, he left behind an empire built entirely on fear and watered with more blood than any other conqueror in history. His tomb in Samarkand bears an inscription warning that whoever disturbs his rest will unleash terrors upon the world. When Soviet archaeologists opened the tomb in 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union just days later, suggesting that some curses carry weight across the centuries. Timur's legacy is one of pure destruction. Unlike other great conquerors who built lasting institutions or spread beneficial ideas, he left nothing behind but death and devastation. His empire collapsed immediately after his death, unable to survive without the terror that had held it together. Yet his methods would inspire other tyrants throughout history, proving that the techniques of systematic cruelty, once perfected, never truly disappear from human knowledge. The 14th century, which saw Timur's rise to power, was also witnessing the collapse of medieval society across Europe. The Black Death had killed perhaps 1/3 of the continent's population, while crop failures and climate change had brought famine and desperation to millions. In this atmosphere of crisis and despair, the brutal oppression of the feudal system became increasingly intolerable to the common people. The explosion of popular rage came first in France, where the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 gave the world a glimpse of what happened when the downtrodden finally turned on their oppressors. The immediate cause was the capture of King John II at the Battle of Poitiers, which left France leaderless and prey to English raiders. While the nobility retreated to their castles, the peasants were left defenseless, their crops burned, and their families murdered by foreign soldiers. The man who would lead the revolt was known only as Guillaume Cal, and his origins remain shrouded in mystery. What is certain is that he possessed a charismatic ability to channel peasant rage into organized violence. His followers, contemptuously called Jacques by the nobles, began their uprising by attacking isolated manor houses and slaughtering their inhabitants. The rebels' fury, built up over centuries of oppression, manifested in acts of shocking brutality that matched anything committed by their social superiors. At the castle of Meaux, they captured the knight Enguerrand de Coucy and forced him to watch as they raped and murdered his wife and daughters before slowly flaying him alive. At other estates, they roasted nobles over slow fires or buried them alive in the dungeons where they had once imprisoned peasants. The Jacques showed particular creativity in their revenge against the symbols of noble authority. They forced captured knights to eat their own horses, animals that represented their military supremacy. They burned charters and legal documents that recorded peasant obligations, dancing around the flames as centuries of written oppression turned to ash. Some nobles were forced to watch as their children were murdered before meeting similar fates themselves. Yet the peasant revolt, for all its initial success, was doomed from the beginning. The nobles, once they recovered from their initial shock, proved far more skilled in organized violence than their former serfs. Charles the Bad of Navarre rallied the aristocracy with promises of vengeance, and the nobles' response was swift and merciless. The Battle of Mello marked the beginning of the end for the Jacquerie. Guillaume Cal, lured to a peace conference under false pretenses, was captured and subjected to tortures that surpassed even peasant imagination. The nobles forced him to wear a red-hot iron crown in mockery of his royal ambitions, before slowly dismembering him while he still lived. His followers, witnessing their leader's fate, scattered in terror. The noble counterattack that followed was systematic in its brutality. Entire villages suspected of supporting the revolt were burned, their inhabitants killed without regard for age or gender. Pregnant women were cut open, and their unborn children impaled on spikes. Children were thrown into wells or burned alive in their homes. The roads of northern France became lined with gallows where peasant rebels hung in chains, their bodies left to rot as warnings to future generations. At the village of Saint-Loup-d'Esserent, over 300 peasants who had taken refuge in the church were burned alive when the nobles set the building ablaze. Their screams could be heard for miles as the ancient stones cracked from the heat, and the roof collapsed in showers of sparks. The nobles celebrated this victory with a feast held among the still smoldering ruins, toasting their success while the smell of burned flesh filled the air. The repression that followed the Jacquerie was designed not merely to punish the rebels, but to terrorize the entire peasant class into permanent submission. Special courts were established to try suspected rebels, and these tribunals operated with a casual disregard for evidence or justice. Merely being accused of sympathy for the revolt was often enough to warrant execution, and entire families were wiped out on the testimony of single witnesses. 23 years later, England would face its own peasant uprising, sparked by similar grievances, but led by men who had learned from the French experience. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 began with the simple refusal of villagers in Essex to pay yet another poll tax, but it quickly escalated into a full-scale rebellion that threatened the very foundations of English society. Wat Tyler, the revolt's charismatic leader, was a man of obscure origins who possessed both military skill and an understanding of popular grievances that made him far more dangerous than Guillaume Cal had been. Tyler's followers were not merely angry peasants, but included artisans, minor clergy, and even some lesser nobles who had grown disgusted with the corruption and incompetence of the royal government. The rebels' march on London was marked by systematic attacks on the symbols of oppression that had ground down the common people for generations. At Canterbury, they stormed the cathedral and dragged Archbishop Simon Sudbury from the altar, forcing him to swear an oath to their cause, before releasing him with warnings of what would happen if he betrayed them. The Savoy Palace, magnificent residence of John of Gaunt, was not merely destroyed, but obliterated with a thoroughness that demonstrated the rebels' sophisticated understanding of symbolic violence. Every tapestry, every piece of furniture, every work of art was systematically destroyed or burned. The rebels refused to keep any loot for themselves, understanding that their revolt was about justice rather than mere theft. When the rebels finally reached London, they found the city gates opened by sympathetic citizens who had suffered under the same oppressive taxation and corrupt administration. The Tower of London, symbol of royal authority, fell to the rebels who executed Archbishop Sudbury and Treasurer Robert Hales with an efficiency that spoke of careful planning rather than mob fury. The young King Richard II, only 14 years old, showed remarkable courage in agreeing to meet with Tyler and the rebel leaders at Smithfield. The confrontation that followed would become one of the most dramatic moments in English history. As the teenage king faced down thousands of armed peasants with nothing but his royal authority and boyish charisma, Tyler's demands were revolutionary for their time. The abolition of serfdom, the establishment of free trade, and the punishment of corrupt officials. For a moment, it seemed as though England might peacefully transition to a more just social order. But the meeting ended in violence when the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, struck Tyler down with his sword, allegedly because the rebel leader had drawn his dagger in the king's presence. The death of Tyler might have sparked a massacre, as thousands of his followers prepared to avenge their leader. Instead, young Richard demonstrated political genius by riding forward alone and declaring himself their new leader, promising to grant all their demands if they would disperse peacefully. The rebels, awed by the king's courage and trusting in royal promises, gradually melted away to their homes. But Richard's promises proved as empty as his youth might have suggested. Once the immediate danger had passed, the king and his advisors launched a campaign of repression that made the aftermath of the Jacquerie seem merciful by comparison. Special courts were established in every county, and the king personally oversaw many of the trials, taking evident pleasure in condemning former rebels to gruesome deaths. The execution of John Ball, the radical priest who had preached equality among men, was particularly savage. Ball was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still conscious. His entrails were burned before his eyes as he was forced to watch his own body being destroyed. Finally, he was beheaded and quartered, his remains sent to different parts of the kingdom as warnings to other would-be revolutionaries. At St. Albans, the abbot who had supported the rebels was forced to watch as his monastery's charters of liberty were burned. Then he was slowly strangled with the very rope that had once hung the monastery bell. His death throes providing entertainment for the royal officials who had come to restore order. The monastery itself was looted and partially destroyed, its treasures seized as punishment for supporting peasant demands. the repression continued for months, with over 1,500 executions recorded and thousands more imprisonments and mutilations. Entire villages were fined enormous sums for supporting the revolt, money they could never hope to pay, ensuring generations of debt bondage. The survivors of the revolt found themselves worse off than before, their dreams of freedom replaced by an oppression more systematic and thorough than anything they had previously endured. Yet even as the last rebels were being hunted down and executed, new horrors were emerging in distant parts of the world. In the Italian peninsula, the Renaissance was dawning with promises of cultural renewal and artistic achievement. But this rebirth of classical learning would also produce some of history's most sophisticated practitioners of political cruelty. The rise of Cesare Borgia represents perhaps the perfect synthesis of Renaissance culture and medieval brutality. Born in 1475 as the illegitimate son of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI, Cesare was destined from birth to play a leading role in the brutal politics of Renaissance Italy. The peninsula at this time was divided into dozens of competing city-states, each ruled by families whose survival depended on their ability to outmaneuver, outfight, and outlast their rivals. Cesare's early life was shaped by the corrupting influence of papal court politics, where murder was a common tool of diplomacy, and family loyalty could not protect against fraternal ambition. When his father ascended to the papal throne in 1492, the Borgia family found itself at the center of European politics, with access to both spiritual authority and material wealth that could purchase armies and assassins in equal measure. The young Cesare was initially groomed for a career in the church, receiving a cardinal's hat at the unprecedented age of 18. But his true talents lay in warfare and statecraft rather than theology, and he chafed at the restrictions of clerical life. The opportunity to escape came with the mysterious death of his older brother Juan in 1497, an event that removed the primary obstacle to Cesare's secular ambitions. Juan's murder remains one of history's great unsolved crimes, but contemporary observers had little doubt about the identity of the killer. The brothers had been rivals for their father's favor and competing for the same military commands. When Juan's body was pulled from the Tiber River, bearing multiple stab wounds, witnesses recalled seeing Cesare in the vicinity on the night of the murder. The assassination of Juan Borgia reveals something essential about Cesare's character. This was not a crime of passion committed in the heat of anger, but a calculated murder designed to eliminate a rival and clear the path to power. The methodical planning required to kill his own brother and dispose of the body suggests a mind capable of viewing human relationships purely in terms of personal advantage. With Juan dead and his father's support secured, Cesare abandoned his cardinal's robes and embraced his destiny as a warrior prince. His marriage to Charlotte d'Albret, sister of the King of Navarre, provided him with a noble title and access to French military support. Armed with papal blessing and foreign soldiers, he launched his campaign to carve out a personal kingdom in central Italy. Caesar's conquest of the Romagna region demonstrated his mastery of Renaissance warfare, which combined traditional military tactics with innovative psychological operations. His siege of Imola in 1500 showed how he had learned from the examples of earlier conquerors like Timur. Understanding that reputation for cruelty could be as effective as actual force. When Imola surrendered after a brief siege, Caesar ordered the public execution of the city's leading citizens, not because they had resisted, but to establish his reputation for ruthlessness. The executions were carried out with theatrical precision, each death designed to send a specific message to potential enemies. Some were hanged, others were beheaded, and a few were burned alive, their different fates corresponding to their perceived levels of resistance to Borgia rule. The siege of Faenza in 1501 revealed another aspect of Caesar's character: his ability to combine mercy and cruelty in ways that maximized their political impact. When the city finally surrendered after months of resistance, Caesar initially showed clemency to its young lord, Astora Manfredi, even inviting him to join the Borgia court. This apparent generosity impressed observers and suggested that submission to Caesar might be rewarded rather than punished. However, Astora's fate was sealed from the moment of his surrender. After several months of apparent favor, the young lord simply disappeared, almost certainly murdered on Caesar's orders. The message was clear. Caesar might show initial mercy to encourage surrender, but ultimate loyalty was the only guarantee of survival. This combination of false hope followed by inevitable betrayal proved more terrifying to Caesar's enemies than simple brutality would have been. The massacre at Capua in 1501 demonstrated Caesar's willingness to employ mass terror when more subtle methods proved insufficient. When the city resisted his siege, Caesar allied himself with French forces and participated in the systematic slaughter of its population. Over 5,000 people died in a single day of organized killing that shocked even the violence-hardened soldiers of Renaissance Italy. Caesar's personal participation in the massacre was noted by several chroniclers, who described how he seemed to take genuine pleasure in the killing. Unlike other commanders who delegated the dirty work to their subordinates, Caesar was seen moving through the streets with a bloodied sword, personally executing prisoners and civilians with an enthusiasm that disturbed even his own soldiers. The most revealing insight into Caesar's character comes from his treatment of his former allies, the Orsini family, who had helped him establish his power in central Italy. When political circumstances changed, and the Orsini became potential threats rather than useful allies, Caesar invited them to a reconciliation meeting at Senigallia in 1502. The Orsini lords, despite their suspicions, agreed to attend the meeting, trusting in the conventions of Renaissance diplomacy that protected negotiating parties. Caesar welcomed them with elaborate ceremony and apparent warmth, hosting a magnificent feast that seemed to mark the restoration of their alliance. Only when the meal was finished did his guards reveal their true purpose. Seizing the unsuspecting guests, and binding them with chains that had been prepared in advance. What followed was not quick execution, but prolonged torture designed to extract both information and confession. Each Orsini lord was subjected to different torments, their screams echoing through Caesar's palace as he personally supervised their interrogation. Some were strangled slowly with silk cords. Others were poisoned with compounds that caused agonizing internal burning, and at least one was skinned alive while conscious. The betrayal at Senigallia became legendary throughout Italy, establishing Caesar as a master of political treachery, whose word could never be trusted. This reputation proved more valuable than any army, as potential enemies understood that neither negotiation nor surrender could guarantee safety from Borgia vengeance. The very uncertainty about Caesar's intentions became a weapon that paralyzed his opponents and prevented the formation of effective coalitions against him. Niccolò Machiavelli, who served as a diplomatic observer of Caesar's campaigns, was both horrified and fascinated by what he witnessed. In his later work, The Prince, Machiavelli would use Caesar as the model for his ideal ruler, arguing that effective statecraft required the ability to use both force and fraud without moral restraint. The Florentine diplomat understood that he was witnessing the emergence of a new type of political leader, one who combined classical learning with medieval brutality to create something uniquely dangerous. Caesar's downfall came not from military defeat or moral reckoning, but from the simple biological fact that his power depended entirely on his father's papal authority. When Alexander VI died suddenly in 1503, possibly from malaria, but perhaps from poison intended for an enemy, Caesar found himself isolated and vulnerable. The new pope, Julius II, was determined to restore direct papal control over the territories Caesar had conquered. The speed of Caesar's collapse demonstrated how fragile his achievements had been. Without papal backing, his mercenary armies melted away, his allies abandoned him, and his enemies emerged from hiding to reclaim their lost territories. The man who had terrorized central Italy for years found himself a fugitive, dependent on the charity of foreign rulers who had little reason to support a fallen tyrant. Caesar's final years were spent in Spanish prisons, and then as a minor military commander in the service of his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre. His death in 1507, killed in a minor skirmish during a siege that had nothing to do with his former glory, was as anticlimactic as his rise had been spectacular. The master manipulator, who had once controlled the fate of cities and princes, died anonymously on a battlefield far from Italy. His body reportedly left unburied until local peasants took pity on the corpse. Yet Caesar's influence extended far beyond his brief moment of power. His methods and philosophy, as interpreted by Machiavelli, would inspire political leaders for centuries to come. The idea that effective governance required the systematic use of cruelty, that moral considerations were obstacles to political success, and that the ends always justified the means became central tenets of modern statecraft. In examining the life of Caesar Borgia, we see how the Renaissance, for all its cultural achievements, also perfected the arts of political violence that had been developing throughout the medieval period, where earlier tyrants like Vlad or Timur had relied on raw brutality to achieve their goals. Cæsar demonstrated how cruelty could be refined and systematized, made into a science rather than merely an instinct. The legacy of medieval cruelty did not end with figures like Cæsar Borgia, but continued to evolve and adapt to new circumstances. The techniques of terror developed during the Middle Ages would be refined and employed by later generations of tyrants, proving that the capacity for systematic evil, once unleashed, never entirely disappears from human society. As we reflect on these dark chapters of human history, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about our own nature. The medieval world produced its share of saints and heroes, but it also gave birth to monsters whose cruelty exceeded anything found in our worst nightmares. These were not alien beings from another species, but human beings like ourselves, shaped by circumstances and choices that revealed the depths of depravity that lie dormant within the human heart. The lesson of medieval cruelty is not that we have evolved beyond such behavior, but that the potential for both great good and great evil remains constant across the centuries. The same human nature that produced the soaring cathedrals of Gothic architecture and the sublime poetry of Dante also created the forests of impaled corpses and the towers of severed heads that marked the passage of history's cruelest figures. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that many of these acts of cruelty were committed by individuals who believed themselves to be serving higher purposes. The Crusaders who slaughtered the innocent inhabitants of Jerusalem were convinced they were doing God's work. Vlad the Impaler saw himself as a defender of Christendom against Islamic expansion. Even Cæsar Borgia could argue that his brutality served the cause of Italian unification and political stability. This capacity for self-deception, for transforming evil into apparent good through the alchemy of ideology and self-interest, may be the most dangerous aspect of human nature. It allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty while maintaining their sense of moral righteousness. It explains how civilized societies can suddenly descend into barbarism, and how the lessons of history can be forgotten with such tragic regularity. Yet even in the darkest periods of medieval history, there were always individuals who resisted the tide of cruelty and maintained their moral compass despite enormous pressure to conform. The monks who hid Jewish families from crusading mobs, the knights who refused to participate in massacres, the common people who showed mercy even when their leaders demanded blood. These forgotten heroes remind us that human dignity can survive even the worst circumstances. Their examples suggest that while the capacity for cruelty may be universal, so too is the capacity for compassion. The choice between these two paths remains open to every generation, every society, and every individual. The study of medieval cruelty serves not to despair at human nature, but to understand the forces that can corrupt it and the vigilance required to resist them. As we close our journey through these shadows of the past, we carry with us the sobering knowledge that the medieval world's capacity for cruelty was not an aberration, but a revelation of potentials that remain present in our own time. The names may change, the technologies may evolve, but the fundamental choice between compassion and cruelty remains as relevant today as it was in the age of Vlad the Impaler and Caesar Borgia. In remembering these dark chapters, we honor not only the victims of medieval cruelty, but also the ongoing struggle to build a world where such horrors become increasingly impossible. The vigilance required to maintain human dignity is eternal, and the price of forgetting these lessons is measured not in abstract moral principles, but in very real human suffering. Perhaps that is the most important lesson these medieval monsters can teach us, that the capacity for both evil and good lies within us all, and that the choices we make, individually and collectively, determine which side of our nature will prevail. In facing this truth honestly, we take the first step toward ensuring that the cruelest chapters of human history remain in the past where they belong, remembered but never repeated.